Today I want to expand on the recent discussions on Runslinger's channel by exploring tabletop role-playing games and how conversation is the functional medium of tabletop role-playing games. As mentioned in my first video in this series, unlike video games or board games, which commonly lean into visuals or rigid mechanics, TTRPGs excel through dialogue. But how does this conversation flow? What makes it different from everyday speech? How do mechanics shape the way we talk at the table? Hello, Brian, viewers here, and welcome to Stochastic Agency, where we spotlight the esoteric and sometimes the well-duh nature of role-playing games. Before I get too far, I'd like to address an elephant in the room. These observations are based on unmodified interpretations of the rules. This is the game played according to the rules as written, not when players decide they don't want to follow some or all of the rules. And my perspective, and for the purposes of this discussion, whenever you change rules or you alter them, you only exchange one set of speech influencing guidelines for another. How TTRP conversations flow. First, to understand its flow, let's compare aspects of everyday speech and what could be observed at the table. Now, unlike everyday speech where we talk freely, tabletop role-playing games do have somewhat of a structure and a way to manage the dialogue that happens. To help this comparison, I've included some examples illustrating my attempt at understanding this and how it looks and how they could be categorized. So based on how they guide player dialogue from free-form to turn-based exchanges, where can I find the key mechanisms that shape how they cause players to interact? Now, nuance and subtext, innuendo, double entendre, and many other things can add multiple layers to everyday conversation. However, a tabletop role-playing game adds like in-dialogue conversation and player character actions. When players use voices, accents, or descriptive speech, it's like the speech tags in written dialogue. The he said, she said, or they said to show who is speaking when. Only here you could say that these do indicate an in-character speech versus out-of-character speech when the player is speaking. Descriptive actions, that's where participants narrate the actions in response to what the world is doing or other characters. This could be when dice rolls and rules come into play. There's a speech mechanism here that's based on mechanics, and it uses formal rule-based language. Of course, there's everyone's favorite meta discussion, where players strategize outside of character and outside of the world to discuss tactics and clarifying rules. Now, these layers constantly shift, creating a very dynamic and unique structure to role-playing game. Structured stops and transitions. In everyday conversations, we change topics as we ramble from one tangent to another. But in tabletop role-playing games, the conversation does kind of follow a structured stopping point, especially when you think about formal or social encounters. You can hear scenes transitioning naturally from the conversation from moment to moment, like when moving from the tavern to the deep, dark woods and then into a dungeon. There are also game master cues that signal when they need to move something forward, like, what are you doing next? We also have player-driven statements, and you'll often hear me say this as player intentions or player declarations. This is when players take decisive actions, creating a clear transition, such as, I charge forward with my sword drawn. We start an initiative now? In a D&D combat sequence, players must wait until their initiative turn before declaring a full round of actions. Now, more recent designs have included what you could say are interjections, where characters have some ability to help or hinder actions not directly stated by them. While in more narrative-driven games like Fiasco, players dictate when scenes shift dramatically. I think we need a fight scene here. How mechanics shape speech. But a game's rules do not just govern dice rolls. They exert some influence over how and when players speak. Upcoming graphics will show some different role-playing game structures, attempts to categorize them based on games and how they guide the dialogue, from free-form storytelling to turn-based exchanges. So what can all of this help us understand about how to play and what goes on? Well, highly structured games, from D&D to Blades in the Dark, attempt to regulate the conversation with certain mechanical triggers. Loose narrative games like Fiasco, 10 Candles, allow a conversation to develop more naturally, but impose that all-important pacing mechanism everyone talks about. Physical mechanics alter the dynamics of speech. Dread's Jenga Tower and 10 Candles, the extinguishing of the candles, these are physical. Solo RPGs rely on intrapersonal dialogue, turning self-reflection into the primary form of the conversation. Now, I'd like to spotlight one game here called The Quiet Year. The reason why is because The Quiet Year stands apart by limiting direct conversation between players, forcing storytelling through an individual contribution rather than an open discussion. Its structure intentionally removes traditional dialogue in favor of interpretive and isolated narration, creating unique conversation flows. Unlike other games where negotiation and role play dominate, The Quiet Year enforces narrative restraint, emphasizing implication over the direct talk, implicit rules that shape TTRPG talk. Beyond explicit mechanisms, there are often unspoken social rules that shape the way we talk at the table. The first and foremost thing I want to say here is this is all observational. Remember, the term here is implicit, as these things are often what come up in all of the YouTube tips and tricks videos you're watching. So to start with, we've got the rule of spotlight sharing. This one should be familiar. Its intention is to ensure that all players get a chance to speak and contribute. Games like Fate do this by encouraging players to pass focus around using aspects. And next, you could say we have a rule of fictional commitment, meaning that when the GM describes something in the world, or the player makes certain statements about the character or the world, everyone must treat it as real within the imagined play space. For example, if the GM says, "The castle gates are locked," the players must respond to that reality instead of questioning its existence. And last, we have what you could say is the rule of shared authority. Unlike everyday conversations where anyone can cite actual facts, the GM in most typical games establishes the world and describes the NPCs, monsters, and treasures. Players describe their character actions, like picking a lock. Now, subsystems like Microscope and Fiasco are deliberate hybrids, distributing the control over the world equally, allowing all players to dictate certain events and aspects of world building. Why this matters. So why does any of what I'm rambling on about matter? Trust me when I say that I've read more than a few blog posts expounding how conversation is the focus, and those that would say that everything I've said and what the blogs say is useless. Observing or analyzing what we're talking about in these conversations and how they form a structure, unlike a debate or direct storytelling, improvisational theater is helpful because much of what we do at the table is a collaboration of many forms of communication. After all this, what I'm hoping that we can take away from these kinds of discussions is that RPGs are sustained through spoken and written words. Conversation isn't just tabletop RPGs talking. It's structured and rule influenced, but also a creative way to bring emergent narratives to life. Whether you're a player or a game designer, think about how conversation can enhance your game. Now, I know this isn't the typical video everyone sees on YouTube when searching for tabletop role-playing games, and I'm fine with that. I don't have all the answers, and I mostly just have a bunch of ideas, rolling around in my head. We're talking about conversations in tabletop role-playing games in order to talk about conversations in tabletop role-playing games and how this particular type of conversation is different. There is still so much to talk about. How does imagination fit into this? How does improvisational play fit into this? And how can you get better at it? Are there tools you can use to sharpen that kind of well-played game? How does pre-imagine detract from the experience, and what the heck does that even mean? So in the meantime, talk to each other about how you're playing. You might discover hidden clues to a well-played game somewhere in your TTRPG conversation. Like, dislike, comment, subscribe at your own discretion, and take a moment to think about if and when your agency and the conversation branches every time you roll those dice.